So what if the United States had a civil war in 2025? Now recently there's been a lot of polarization in the United States. There's been the rise of extremism, and generally the country is about as divided as it's been since the Civil War. Now, do I think an actual civil war is on the horizon for the United States? Not really, but a few decisions could be made which could definitely put the country on that path. But today we're going to be looking at a fictional war scenario where the United States goes into full-on civil war. If you guys enjoyed today's scenario, make sure to leave a like on it and subscribe to the channel if you're new. All the support is greatly appreciated as we're trying to get to 200,000 subscribers by September. And let's go ahead and jump straight into this scenario. So there are many ways that an American civil war could start, but I think the most obvious and most blatant way that it would start right now is something to do with the current administration. And recently there's been a lot of beef between the states. More specifically, California has been doing some fun and interesting things. So I think we'll start the civil war there. California breaks away from the United States. Now, California would not break away on their own. This would be a very hard decision for them to make, and if they were going to make this decision, they would likely need the help of other states around them. And I'm of course talking about the states of Oregon and Washington. Now, what all these states have in common is that they are Democratic strongholds, and California is of course one of the most left-leaning states, although they do have a very high Republican population. Still, though, the government is pretty much entirely Still, though, their government is mostly entirely Democratic, so they will be leading the charge here in the American Civil War. Now, when these guys break away, they will automatically trigger all of the other United States states to get involved in the war. So at this point, we have California, Oregon, and Washington versus the rest of the United States. Now, California is a very strong state. They have one of the top economies in the world, top 5 economy in the world. Population super high, so theoretically, California would be able to run as a country, but then, of course, they're going against the entirety of the United States here. But this movement will not stop with just California, Oregon, and Washington. So while the rest of the United States will begin to push into these territories, claiming over areas where the Democratic government is most unpopular, which also includes up here in Oregon and Washington, more and more states, and specifically states over here on the East Coast, will begin to think about this civil war and may start to break away as well. Now, this is off topic completely, but I do want to say this is the map that started mapping on my channel. This particular map I did in my first mapping video on, which was fixing the US state borders, and that was like 4 years ago. So shout out to this map. We wouldn't be here today without this map. Anyway, back on the East Coast, these states will finally make the decision to break away from the United States. So Massachusetts is the first country to do so, and they are quickly followed by other states around them like Rhode Island, Connecticut, Vermont, and New Hampshire. But at this point, it gets a little bit more complicated because New York is having a little bit of a split. Upstate New York and the Long Island, New York are not the same at all. Upstate New York is your typical Republican state, and then Long Island is, your populated city with millions of people within it. So what we have happening in New York is basically the populated city areas of the state break away and join the Democratic coalition, while the rest of the state, which is the remainder of Long Island, and then up here in upstate, decide to stay with the Union. Now, there's a similar thing that happens in Maine with these southern and kind of more populated areas breaking away, and the effect is also seen in New Jersey with a majority of their state breaking away. Not all of it, but a good portion of it, and more specifically the eastern coastal areas. So the Democratic coalition now has a new front opened up over here in New England, but the idea of this rebellion against the United States and its government is beginning to spread more and more throughout the country, and more specifically, the major cities of the United States are now kind of going into open rebellion. Now, the United States is a very, very interesting country with the way that it does politics, because you look at a state like Texas, for example, and it's a red state by a lot of margin in elections. But when you look at the voting numbers in Texas, you'll see that there are millions of Democrats there, similar to how, there are millions of Republicans in California, but you'll never see these two states flipping back and forth anytime soon. Now, these millions of Democrats in Texas are in the cities like Houston, Austin, El Paso, Dallas. All of those major cities in Texas are full of Democratic voters, while the rest of the state, which is, mostly your farms or small towns and communities, those are your Republican voters. So if all of these Democratic cities were to break away and start to do their own thing and not work with the rest of the state, it would be very bad for the rest of the state because the Democratic cities are the ones that bring in all the money. Now, of course, you can't have a city without food, and that's where the Republican farms and stuff like that are needed. So yes, the rural and urban areas do need each other, but I would say that the rural areas need the cities slightly more than the cities need the rural areas. And that's because you can import food from other countries. And since we are in full-on civil war, that whole importing food thing is definitely possible. It's just that you have to do it through one of the coastal areas, and you also have to remember you're beating back against the United States Navy, which let's go ahead and address that. So the US Navy is currently compromised, half of it is. California has gained complete control over the Pacific Fleet over here in California, and as for the Atlantic Fleet, it is stationed over here in Norfolk, Virginia. Currently, Virginia is fighting on the side of the Union, but this is a Democratic state, so we'll have to see what happens. For now, though, the blue team will begin to invade into areas of New York, and specifically, they'll target these major cities like Albany, where they have a strong Democratic upper hand. They'll also be able to seize the rest of Long Island, and more New Jersey will begin to flip over to the Democrats. At this point, the governor of New Jersey goes ahead and says that we are going to officially join this coalition, meaning that all of the state is now involved, and a similar thing happens in New York with the governor declaring the exact same status. With the coalition over here in the Northeast getting a little bit stronger, it is now around time that more of these blue states begin to jump in. More specifically, we have the state of Illinois losing Chicago, which if you didn't know, Chicago is basically the entire population of Illinois, and their governor will try to declare the same thing that New Jersey and New York's governor did, being that the state of Illinois is in open rebellion and joining the Democratic coalition. But like I just said, a majority of Illinois' population is up in Chicago, meaning that the rest of the state is purely just Republican voters. And with that in mind, it would be a lot harder for him to gain complete control over his state in this matter. So for now, Illinois will focus on just taking the northern areas of their state. Now this scenario is definitely assuming a lot of things, and I want to go ahead and bring to light what those things are. So first of all, theoretically, the US military, who is loyal to the Constitution and not loyal to betraying states, which the blue team is the, they're the aggressor, the breakaways in this scenario. So the US military would be loyal to the red team in this case, but we're going to assume that the military is split. We're going to assume that the administration did something that breaks the Constitution and, defies the law, which automatically makes the military have the moral question of, is what we're doing right? And with that in mind, we're going to assume that the military is going to represent their states. So like, for example, if a member of the military is from California, they're going to go back home and fight for California. If a member of the military is from like Arkansas, they're going to go home and fight for Arkansas. If they're from Pennsylvania, they'll go help Pennsylvania. But we're also going to keep in mind that these states are fairly split in their voting. So like I was just saying, Pennsylvania is a Republican state at this point, but they are a pretty split state. They are a swing state, meaning they have a pretty similar amount of Republican and Democratic voters. With that in mind, we can also assume that the military personnel going back to their states to fight for it are either choosing between Republican or Democrat, splitting that number into two, meaning that this war is actually a lot more even than it looks. So with all of that in mind, it's time for the Democratic front to expand once more. The entire state of Delaware will go ahead and join in on the coalition. Yeah, there's like no Republicans in this state. Well, no, there definitely are. I've driven through Delaware many times, and half of it is just farms until you get to the coast, which is where all the people are. Anyway, though, we're now going to go over to Maryland, and much similar, what we have happening in Maryland is the governor is going to declare his state to join the Democratic coalition. And Maryland is a pretty safely Democratic state. The only areas of this state which are like Republican or over here in the Panhandle, and like maybe south over here in this area, I think. I could be wrong on that one. But with Maryland and Delaware joining the coalition, Pennsylvania will start to get squeezed a little bit. And what we have happening here is the Philadelphia area and the their capital Harrisburg breaking away. I kind of blanked on what their capital was for a second. But like I said, this is the more populated area of Pennsylvania, so it's more likely than not the people here are more Democratic and thus will be more willing to join in on the rebellion. Now, Washington, D.C. is probably the most interesting thing to talk about here because Washington, D.C. is the most liberal area of the United States. They are the most Democratic area. There are little to no Republicans in the capital other than the government. DC's population is roughly 1 million, and to be honest with you, if those 1 million people were to take up arms against the government, assuming they're being supplied by the Democratic coalition, well, the government would have to flee DC. And that's what we have happening here. The federal government will leave DC because it's not safe. It is a Democratic stronghold, and that will become the new capital of the Democratic rebellion, likely after New York, because right now this is on the front line and you don't want to put a capital there just yet. So the government will flee over here to Texas and they will set up base in Austin, Texas. For now, we see a few more states join the rebellion, with Hawaii joining in on the blue team and Colorado openly defying the government. It's at this point that the domino effect begins to happen and the Democrats will break away from the United States for the second time in history. After a brief campaign into Northern Virginia, they take over those major cities there, and the state governor, who is not a Democrat but will soon be a Democrat, will decide to go ahead and flip the state over to join in on the Democratic coalition. Now, this is a very interesting state because I live here, so I know most about it, but basically all of Virginia's major cities are right here, and then like right here, and then like right here, and then everything else is just Republican. So it would be interesting to see how exactly that would play out in a civil war, but we're just going to go ahead and give the entire state to the blue team. And with this state joining in on the side of the blue team, they also gain control over the Atlantic Fleet stationed in Norfolk, Virginia, meaning that even though the blue team is as small as it is, they still have control over the entirety of the US Navy, assuming we're not including like smaller battalions stationed here and there, or like Coast Guard stuff. But they have control over both the Pacific and Atlantic fleets. But like I was saying earlier, there is now a domino effect in effect, and all of the Democratic states will officially join the rebellion. So that includes Minnesota, the rest of Illinois, and New Mexico. So right now, this is an exact replica of what the election of 2024 looked like. Now let's continue on with the fighting. So back over on the West Coast, we can see that the sides are still going in favor of the red team here. A majority of the US military that is fighting for the red team is probably in this area at this time, because this is where the rebellion began. So they'll take over around half of each of these states, which is no big deal because no one lives in the pink areas. All of the important stuff is along the coast. Now, as for New Mexico, they are in a very, very sticky situation here because New Mexico is one of the poorest and one of the weakest states in the United States. And with their surrounding neighbors being who they are, New Mexico is in some trouble, as they will more likely than not lose Santa Fe, lose Albuquerque, and have to surrender back over to the Union. With that in mind, we now see that Colorado is all on their own over here, but that's okay because they have the geography to hold out for a little bit. Now, I did say a little bit because the US will attempt to invade Colorado, but like I said, they have the geography of the Rocky Mountains to hold off these invading forces for as long as they need. Now, at this point in the war, we have a very interesting thing happening over here in Nevada. The entire south of the country goes ahead and breaks away. Nevada's a state, not a country. But Las Vegas will break away on the side of the Democratic coalition, which is kind of indicative of how this state works. It is a Republican state as of recently, but historically, or not historically, but more recently before that, it was a Democratic state, most likely because of Las Vegas down here and their capital, Carson City. But Vegas will break away and join the side of the Democrats because that's exactly what they would do, and this will help push all of the red forces out of Southern California, which is arguably the most important area for the blue team at this point, other than New York City. Jumping over here to the East Coast, we would see the Republicans invade into this area of Virginia. They would have a very hard time with the geography of this area, but nonetheless, they will try to push up and go towards Virginia's capital, which is, of course, Richmond. On the other side of things, up north, we see Pennsylvania begin to lose even more of its base as the Erie and Pittsburgh areas break away and join the side of the Democratic coalition, leaving this kind of large area in the middle of the state up for grabs. Now, at this point, the governor of Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro, will go ahead and try to declare that his state has joined the side of the Democratic coalition. But as we know, most recently, there are more Republicans than there are Democrats in this state, meaning that even if he were to try to do that, more likely than not, he would be hit with defiance by his own people, and thus we have exactly this happening. Now, the Democratic governor of Michigan will also try to do the same thing, breaking away the Detroit area of this state, and attempting to push forces into the upper area of their state to try to get the whole thing to flip. But very similar to Pennsylvania, this state most recently went to the Republicans despite having a Democratic governor. Now, speaking of Democratic governor, there are a few very Republican states that do have Democratic governors, like Kansas and Kentucky, who are extremely Republican states, however have Democratic governors, because US politics are very weird when it comes to governors. Anyway, over here in Illinois, we have the Republican states having an absolute field day pushing into the south of this very flat nothing state. I flew over Illinois one time and literally looking out the window, all there was just fields. There's nothing else but fields in Illinois. Shout out to Illinois, I guess. But what we have happening here in Wisconsin is definitely more interesting because, first of all, the liberal areas will break away, much like we've seen in other areas of the country. But we see Chicago invade up into Wisconsin, and we also see Minnesota start to invade into Wisconsin. Wisconsin is another one of those states. I think they have a Republican governor. Correct me if I'm wrong on that one, but they were extremely close in the 2024 election. I think it was only like 10,000 votes that separated them, not only in the 2020 election, but also the 2024 election. So these guys really, I mean, they go both ways depending on the year and depending on the candidates. But the Democrats have a very easy time taking over this area of Wisconsin. They capitulate the state, and I did just look it up. Their governor is a Democrat. So what we have happening here is him declaring that his state joins the Democratic coalition, which is definitely possible after Minnesota and Illinois help take out the Republican base here. Now, with this happening, the Upper Peninsula peninsula of Michigan would go bye-bye very quickly. Wisconsin definitely wants that thing. But also, at this point, the Democrats are having a much easier time pushing in to these kind of swing state areas after taking over the cities. So with the Rust Belt now almost all in the Democratic coalition, things are definitely going to change over here in the Northeast. Now on the flip side of things, over on the West Coast, California is doing a decent job at pushing back the invaders, but they are going up against the rest of the red team's military, which at this point would be probably slightly stronger than the blue team's military. If you look at the population density of the United States, a majority of the population is in the blue area highlighted here. So like the entirety of this northeastern coast. But then you have California, one of the most populated states, and then, you know, so on and so forth. So there's a lot of people in the blue areas, and it might be more equal to the red areas than we realize. Now, speaking also of the red areas, there's a ton of weak countries in the red. So like the entire south of the United States is extremely poor, and in a civil war scenario, they're not doing anything. Like, what is Mississippi gonna do? Now, North Carolina, that's a different story. North Carolina is a Republican state, same with Georgia and Florida. Those are all strong would-be countries, but they also have a ton of Democrats in them. So like the Charlotte area of North Carolina will break away and join the Democratic coalition, which frees up Virginia just a little bit, pushing Republican forces over to here and into the plateau area of Virginia. Up north, we also see the blue team push back against the remaining of Republicans in Pennsylvania, completely liberating the state and then also liberating the panhandle of Maryland. Back over in Colorado, we would see the red team's forces continue to squeeze into the state. They are completely landlocked and completely by themselves, and that's really not a recipe for success. Even if they are very mountainous and have the advantage of the Rocky Mountains, Colorado would likely not last much longer. Back south in Virginia, we have them pushing out the Republicans and starting an invasion into this area of North Carolina to go ahead and kind of free up Norfolk a little bit. They want to make sure that this area is safe because, once again, that is where their navy is. And I'm assuming their navy is just doing drive-bys on the coast of like the Carolinas and Florida. I don't know what the California Navy would be doing, maybe trying to secure Alaska to get oil. So like, I'm not too sure exactly how well that would go for California invading into Alaska, considering their geography, and then like, it's Alaska, the biggest state, but maybe they'd be able to do it. There's not a lot of people there. Now, once again, I do want to reiterate that all of the major cities in this country, even if they are in a red area, are probably having small-scale rebellions. So like, you know, Austin, Texas, where the new government is, probably is secure because they're using brute force and, you know, military police. But like a city like Houston, for example, who's only a few miles away, or not a few miles away, but, you know, miles away, would probably be in more so open rebelling against the Texas state government and hence the US government. So even though that isn't highlighted here, it is still happening and it's still affecting these red areas. Now up in Maine, there's a total of like 4 people here and they all just decide to surrender over to the blue team. And let's go ahead and start to finish off the Civil War. So in Illinois, the red team will make good strides to go ahead and get around Chicago. They'll also enter into Wisconsin in an attempt to encircle Chicago. In Minnesota, there are some small gains made in the south, but the surrounding states around Minnesota are kind of like a laughingstock, so like they're not going to invade Minnesota, but at the same time Minnesota isn't strong enough to invade them, so it's kind of a standoff over here. Over on the west coast, we have something very interesting happening here. We have the entirety of the eastern portions of Washington and Michigan breaking away and forming their own state, very similar to how West Virginia broke away from Virginia during the first American Civil War. Now this actually is something that isn't too impossible. Now while I don't think that we're going to see this actually happen in real life in any realistic manner, if a civil war were to break out, the chances of it happening would be a lot higher than what they are just currently. But with these other areas of Washington and Oregon breaking away, the Republicans suddenly have a very strong foothold in both of these northwestern Pacific states. While down south, the struggle continues for them as California continues to liberate more and more of their own territory, now kicking the Republicans completely out of their state and starting an invasion into Nevada, taking over Carson City, and forcing the government to join the Democratic coalition. Over in the Carolina and Virginia area, we now see forces from Texas, Florida, Georgia, the remainder of North Carolina, and small volunteer forces from these weaker southern states all join together to go ahead and stage a counteroffensive in North Carolina and Virginia. And to say the least, this counteroffensive is very successful. They're using a majority of their manpower, their total manpower, to push back over here on the East Coast, now liberating all of North Carolina and starting an invasion into Virginia, quickly taking Richmond and reaching over and capturing Norfolk, which will go ahead and retake the entire Atlantic fleet from the blue team. That's not so good for them, and Virginia will continue to be invaded until eventually they reach the northern areas. The more mountainous areas of the state will go ahead and join the Republican side, but the holdout is now real as the fighting reaches the major cities of the East Coast. In Florida, we have a pretty small scale rebellion happening with the Tampa, Orlando and the Miami areas all breaking away and trying to join the Democratic coalition. But very quickly, what we see is Ron DeSantis killing his own citizens and doing some bad things there. I wouldn't put it past him, but that's what happens. And anyway, now moving back up north. Yes, I will be throwing shade at Ron DeSantis for no reason. The Nova areas of Virginia will slowly but surely be invaded by Republican forces, and it's at this time that they reach the gates of DC, which, like I said, is the new capital of the Democratic coalition. They were able to secure all of Virginia and North Carolina, meaning it was safe for them to move the capital to DC. But at this point, the Republicans are knocking on their door, so at this point, the Democrats will move their capital back to New York City. And that is just mostly for the Eastern Coalition. The Western Coalition also has its capital being over here in Sacramento, but since they aren't connected in any way, they have two capitals still functioning as one coalition. Anyway, though, Ohio will begin to invade into Pennsylvania with the help of the West Virginians. And this invasion will go very well because they take Pittsburgh, which was completely unexpected by the Democratic coalition, and things start to go bad from here. The corner of Pennsylvania falls, DC is taken, and most of Maryland is invaded. A counteroffensive will take place in central Pennsylvania to push back against the Republican invaders, but they are unable to kick them all the way out of the state. And even more so, the counteroffensive in Maryland fails as they fail to reach DC and are unable to retake Annapolis. Back north up here with the Rust Belt states, not much is happening. Michigan and Ohio are not only fighting over their football teams, but also the Toledo Strip, so this just goes back and forth. But the Democrats will make small gains against the Republicans, now taking back some of these areas in Illinois and Wisconsin where they aren't being too supplied, because once again, a majority of the red team's forces are focused on the East Coast and then the West Coast. Speaking of that West Coast, they will now break through into Oregon and reach the coastal areas, splitting off Washington from California, which is no good. Of course, they do still have the naval advantage, so you can still go up there via ship, but there is no longer a land bridge, and as the state of Oregon falls over to Republican forces, things are not looking too bright for the Democrats. A new invasion of Washington will start, and the city of Seattle will be captured, and they will lose. And now it's just California all on their own over here on the West Coast as Republican forces begin their invasion once again. But their invasion is immediately stopped because California has set up a very strong defensive front, and they do have the numbers advantage at this point. So California will be playing defense and just waiting for the East Coast to do something. And to put it simply, the East Coast isn't doing much of anything. The Democrats will lose control over all of Delmarva, but they will now establish a similar defensive front as to what California did in the central area of Pennsylvania. It is at this point in the war that the Civil War stalemates. Now, in real life, the Civil War, I think, also stalemated until the whole Mississippi campaign happened, where I forget what general it was, but they just went down the Mississippi, cut the Confederacy in half, and then from there, it was GG for the Confederacy. Now, that can't happen here because, first of all, these southern states are all Republican now, and second of all, there's like 3 fronts. Now, it is at this point in the war that I'm not too sure what would actually happen, because we have to also remember that the United States is the strongest country in the world and has the most influence out of any country in the world, and also has the most allies out of any country in the world. So, like, what does Europe think about this? What does Asia think about this? What do the United States allies think about this? Well, more likely than not, the Europeans would be picking their sides. So, like, for example, France would more likely side with the Democrats, but Italy would side with the Republicans. The UK, I'm not too sure who they would side with, probably the Democrats. Same thing with like Germany. So Europe is very left-leaning compared to the United States, which is very right-leaning. I'm going to do the funny scale thing. So here we go. We have the politics of the United States here. So this is center, this is the left, and this is the right. So like the Democratic Party's right there, and then the Republican Party's over here, and then like the current administration's over here. So this is all right-leaning stuff. Whereas in Europe, it's a little bit different. So like, for example, left-leaning people in Europe are like over here. People in the center are like right here. And then your right-leaning groups in Europe are like right here. In fact, I would even go as far to say like the left-leaning groups are over here, the center groups are right here, and like the right-leaning groups are like kind of left-leaning, and then you have like the far right stuff like the AfD in Germany, which is over here. But you can kind of see how these politics differ. While they both have their extreme right-leaning groups, there is a lot of difference in the general population, with Europe being a little bit more left-leaning and America being a little bit more right-leaning on the scale. So in that conclusion, I would say that Europe would probably come to the help of the Democrats, whereas countries that have, more right-leaning and more far right-leaning governments like Italy would come to the aid of the Republicans, sending them stuff and food and stuff like that. But also, if a civil war were to break out, more likely than not, we'd also see just Europe stay out of it and let it, run its course. Now, China and Russia would be definitely in the interest of the Republicans here. More specifically, Russia would be doing everything they can to help out the Republican Party. Probably the same with China, although China would likely stay out of it because, well, they would be number one at that point, and they would, get to work on that. So with all that being said, that is actually going to do it for today's scenario. Yeah. I don't know how this war ends because the sides are pretty even though the Republicans have had a very strong counteroffensive. They're not going to be able to take over California with their current state. And they're also probably not going to be able to push up into the Northeast, which is very heavily populated. A lot of trade goes into this area too, and especially in California, a lot of trade goes into there. So really, when you think about this, it's so hard to think about it actually, because all the Democratic cities would be uprising against their state governments, but at the same time, all these Democratic states would have their more rural areas rebelling against their Democratic government. So I don't know. It's not like the first Civil War at all. The first Civil War was over the issue of slavery, and all of these states down here were slave states, and they broke away because they wanted to keep their slaves. This second Civil War is just about politics. So politics is a much broader range than what a single issue is, because there's millions of Democrats in the red area and there's millions of Republicans in the blue areas. So it would just be probably a bloodfest of just death and destruction of the United States. So my message to you is don't start another civil war unless it's absolutely necessary. When is it absolutely necessary? Probably never, unless the Constitution is very obviously discarded and just ignored. But yeah, it would be not a good situation. So let's try to avoid that, America. Let's do our best. Anyway, once again, I want to thank you all so much for watching this war scenario. Make sure to let me know in the comments exactly who you think would win this civil war. Do you think the red team would pull through, as they kind of are right now, or do you think the blue team would have a comeback due to their more money situation, more people maybe situation, and control over the Pacific fleet? You also have to remember that they would probably be able to take over Alaska and get the oil reserves there. But then also, if you want to, you can also account in for the foreign people like Europe or Asia. Let me know all of what you think in the comments below. Let me know if you disagree with the outcome of this scenario. Let me know if you think I'm stupid, all that stuff. Anyway, once again, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. And of course, thank you to all our super fans. This includes Serminator, Static FN, Jazzy Jerboa, Turn Mapping, CTG on YT, Omega the YouTuber, Vista Napper, Garbage Trucks, AdizzPro, Wixo, 7353, Gamer, RS, Australian Geoball Mapping, Augusto, Norwegian, Gail Martinez, Freezioid, Laser Taze, Pablo Sigma Cat, Toad 45, Death Strider X, and DW Cool Dude. Once again, thank you guys.